Maine coast, February 1897. The village of Hallowell Point had seen men build houses out of pine, granite, driftwood, and stubbornness, but no one had ever seen a woman build one out of seaweed. At low tide, Ingrid Madsen walked the flats with a forked rake and a rope sled, dragging gray-green eelgrass from the rack line while the harbor froze behind her. She did not gather it for bedding. She did not gather it for livestock. She stacked it against the frame of her new house. 30 inches thick, wall after wall, roof after roof. By the third week, the cottage looked less like a home, like something the Atlantic had coughed up and left to die on shore. The fishermen laughed first. Then the carpenters came. Then came Amos Pike, the village fire warden, a man who had lost 2 sheds and half his beard to a chimney spark when he was 26. He stood in the lane, staring at Ingrid's walls of dried grass, and said what everyone else had been whispering. "Mrs. Madsen, you are building a chimney with rooms inside it." Ingrid kept tying the eelgrass bundles to the lath. Her hands were red from salt water. Her face was chapped raw. She did not look ashamed. "No," she said. "Building a place where the wind cannot carry the heat away." Amos looked at the tangled gray walls. He saw rot. He saw flame. He saw an immigrant widow too proud to admit she had made a mistake. And before the month was over, half the village had a name for the cottage. They called it the kelp coffin. But when the coldest week anyone could remember rolled down the coast, that ugly seaweed house did something no timber house in Hallowell Point could do. It stayed warm. Not warm near the stove, not warm if you stood in one lucky corner. Warm everywhere. And the first man to understand why, was the same man who had warned her she would burn alive. A story about magic seaweed. It is a story about the mistake people make when they judge a material by what it looks like instead of what it does. Because Ingrid Madsen understood one simple truth most of the village did not. Cold does not break into a house like a thief. Heat escapes like water through a cracked pail. And if you can slow the leak, winter loses its teeth. Ingrid had not come to Maine with money. She had come with 2 trunks, 1 daughter, 1 black dress, and a kind of knowledge that did not impress men who owned sawmills. She was from the Danish island of Lasso, a place where timber was once precious and the sea was not scenery. It was a warehouse. For generations, people there had roofed and packed and weathered their homes with dried seagrass. Not because it was elegant, because it worked. As a girl, Ingrid had helped her father repair roofs after storms. She knew the smell of drying eelgrass. Sharp with salt and rot at first, then clean and papery when the damp had been driven out. She knew how to twist it into ropes, how to comb it into mats, how to pack it so rain would shed from the outside, but air would stay trapped inside. She did not know the English word insulation. She did not know the scientific language of thermal resistance. But she knew what still air could do. Her first Maine winter taught her what moving air could do. The house she rented after her husband died was a thin clapboard box set behind the cannery. It had 2 rooms, a stove with a cracked door, and walls that breathed like a sick horse. At night, the wind found every seam. It came under the door in a white ribbon of frost. It slid behind the wallpaper and lifted it in little blisters. It made the lamp flame lean sideways even when every window was shut. Her daughter, Maren, slept in all her clothes under a wool coat. Ingrid woke 3 times a night to feed the stove, and every morning, the water pail wore a lid of ice. By March, their wood account was larger than their food account. The local answer was always the same. More wood, more coal, more caulking, more stove. Ingrid looked at the walls and saw the real problem. The house was not failing because the fire was too small. It was failing because the container was too weak. A fire can make heat. It cannot teach a bad wall to hold it. So when a small strip of land opened near the salt marsh, Ingrid bought it with the money from sewing sailcloth and mending nets. The land was cheap because it flooded in spring and smelled like mud in August. Men told her it was no place for a proper house. Ingrid thought it was perfect. There was pine enough for a frame, stone enough for a footing, clay enough for plaster, for plaster, and every tide delivered the rest. She began in September, not with seaweed, with dryness. That was the part no one noticed. She did not drag the eelgrass straight from the shore and stuff it into walls. She spread it on racks. She turned it in the weak sun. She lifted it before rain. She rejected the black, slimy piles, and kept only the long, silver-green ribbons that dried light and springy in the hand. For weeks the marsh behind her cottage looked like laundry day after a shipwreck. Ropes of eelgrass hung between poles. Mats lay on reed shelves. Bundles leaned against fences. The whole place smelled like tidewater and salt. The villagers saw mess. Ingrid saw material changing state. Wet grass is weight. Dry eelgrass is trapped air with a skeleton. When the frame went up, it looked ordinary enough. Short pine studs, a steep roof, small windows, a stone hearth, and a long north-facing entry that turned once before reaching the main room. Then Ingrid began packing the walls. She built an inner lath skin and an outer lath skin, leaving a wide hollow between them. Into that hollow she pressed the dried eelgrass in thick springy layers, not loose enough to sag, not tight enough to crush all the air out. Stitched each layer with twine and thin willow rods so the wall held its shape. The roof received the same treatment. Eelgrass mats, overlapping like scales, then a clay lime wash beneath the outer weather skin. By November, the house had swollen into a rounded, gray, bristling thing. It looked too thick for its own windows. The doorway sat deep in the wall, like the mouth of a cave. That was when Amos Pite came. He had the authority of a man who carried a notebook and knew exactly how many houses in the village had bad stovepipes. He tapped the wall with his cane. It gave a dull, soft thud. "Dry grass," he said. "Sea grass," Ingrid answered. "Grass burns. So does pine. Pine is a wall. That is kindling." Ingrid pulled a single strand loose and held it up. It was pale, curled, and brittle-looking. "This burns," she said. Then she pressed her palm flat against the packed wall. "This holds air." Amos snorted. "Air is what makes fire live." "Yes," Ingrid said. "Moving air. Loose air. Not sleeping air." That sentence traveled through the village faster than a gale warning. Sleeping air. Men repeated it at the store. Boys said it while throwing dried weed at one another. Someone painted a coffin shape on a scrap board and leaned it by Ingrid's lane. Maren found it first. She was 12, thin as a rail, and angry enough to carry it inside with both hands. Ingrid looked at the crude drawing, then at her daughter's face. "Leave it by the stove," she said. "Why?" "We need kindling." They burned it that night. But Maren had heard the laughter. She had seen how men looked past her mother, as if Ingrid's accent made her less intelligent, as if poverty had erased arithmetic, as if widowhood had made her careless. "Will it work?" Maren asked. Ingrid did not answer quickly. She listened to the wind pushing against the unfinished walls. She looked at the deep door tunnel, the small windows, the thick roof, the sealed seams. Then she said, "If I have remembered correctly, that was the truth." This was not bravery without fear, under pressure. Every mistake mattered. If the seaweed stayed damp, it could rot. If the wall had gaps, wind could wash through it and steal the heat. If the stovepipe was careless, Amos's warning could become prophecy. So Ingrid was obsessive. She set the stovepipe through a sleeve of stone and clay, never through seaweed. She kept a cleared space around the hearth. She plastered the inner walls smooth. She raised the floor above a dry crawl space packed at the edges. She made the entry turn like a bent elbow so the cold could not run straight into the room. Every choice had the same purpose: stop the leaks. By Christmas, the Madsen house was finished. The village still laughed. Then January came for them. It began with rain. A mean, shining rain that turned rigging to glass and roads to polished bone. Then the wind swung north. The temperature fell so fast that puddles froze with bubbles trapped inside them. By morning, the harbor was locked in ice from the marsh to the outer rocks. Then the true cold arrived. For 9 days, the sky stayed empty and metallic. The sun rose white. The moon looked hard enough to cut rope. Smoke from chimneys rose a few feet and flattened, as if the air itself had become a ceiling. In every house along the point, people retreated toward the stove. Chairs were dragged closer. Beds were pulled into kitchens. Blankets were nailed over doorways. In Amos Pike's own house, the water pitcher froze on the table while the stove was burning. His wife wrapped hot bricks in towels and slid them under the children's blankets. By the 4th day, his woodpile had collapsed into a sad black trench in the snow. He made rounds anyway. That was his job. He checked stovepipes. He warned men not to overfire their stoves. He watched for sparks, because deep cold makes people desperate, and desperate people burn houses down, trying to stay alive. On the 5th morning, he saw smoke coming from Ingrid Madsen's chimney. Not a hard column. Ingrid Madsen's chimney. Not a hard column. Not the frantic, dirty smoke of a stove being fed every 20 minutes. Just a thin blue thread that annoyed him more than it should have. He told himself she had gone careless with fuel, or she was freezing and too proud to ask, or the seaweed walls were holding damp like a sponge, and the whole place would go black with mold by spring. So he went to inspect it. The lane to Ingrid's cottage was drifted to his knees. The marsh was a white field. Ice gripped the eelgrass stubble. His mustache froze against his scarf. But as he came closer, he noticed the roof. Every other house in the village had icicles. Long white teeth hung from eaves where heat escaped through bad roofs, melted snow, and let it freeze again at the edges. Amos knew those icicles well. They were winter's evidence of a house bleeding warmth. Ingrid's roof had none. Snow sat on it in one unbroken white blanket. That made no sense to him. If the inside was warm, the roof should be losing heat. If the inside was cold, the chimney should not be smoking at all. Then he noticed the woodpile. It had barely changed. 2 neat rows of split spruce still stood by the shed, covered with canvas and frost. In weather like this, a family should have been chewing through fuel like a hungry animal. Amos walked to the door tunnel and knocked. No answer. He knocked harder. From inside, he heard something he had not heard in any house that week. Laughter. Not polite laughter. Child laughter. The door opened, and warmth rolled over him so suddenly his frozen eyes watered. Maren stood there without a coat. Behind her, the main room glowed with lamplight. Bread sat on the table under a cloth. A kettle whispered on the stove. Stockings hung from a line, and were actually drying. Clear except for lace-thin frost in the corners. And Ingrid Madsen was sitting at a bench, sewing sailcloth with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Amos stepped inside and forgot to remove his hat. The heat was not fierce. It did not slap him in the face the way overheated kitchens did. It was stranger than that. Even the same warmth at the wall as near the stove. The same warmth at his boots as at his shoulders. No drafts touched his neck. No cold line crawled along the floor. The stove held only a modest fire. 1 log. Not a roaring load. 1 log. Amos looked around like a man searching for the trick. How often do you feed it? He asked. Ingrid tied off her stitch. When it asks. How often? Every few hours. That stove cannot heat this room on 1 log every few hours. It is not heating the room alone, Ingrid said. She touched the wall. All is helping by not stealing. That was when Amos began to understand the shape of his mistake. He had thought of walls as barriers, something to keep weather out. But Ingrid had built something more precise, a heat trap. The science is simple once someone shows it to you. Heat moves from warm places to cold places. It does not need permission. It travels by conduction through solid materials, by convection when moving air carries it, and by radiation across open space. A thin wall is not a wall in winter. It is a short road. Heat crosses it quickly. A drafty wall is worse. It is not just leaking heat through the material. It is letting air physically carry warmth away. One invisible theft at a time. Insulation works because it makes that road longer and harder. The champion is not wood. It is not plaster. It is not seaweed itself. It is still air. Air that cannot move much. Air trapped in fibers, pockets, curls, and cells. Air forced into millions of tiny dead ends, where heat cannot travel quickly. That was Ingrid's secret. Eelgrass looked like waste on the beach. But when it was dried, layered, protected from rain, and sealed from wind, it became a net for still air. The thick walls did not create heat. They slowed heat loss so dramatically that a small fire could do the work of a large one. The fire was not winning a war. It was maintaining a treaty. Amos did not use those words. He only knew that his house was eating wood, and freezing anyway, while this ridiculous gray cottage held warmth like a wool mitten. He left with no warning written in his notebook. But the cold was not finished. On the 7th day, the village pump froze. Then a second well froze. Then a third. Men hacked ice from rain barrels with hatchets. Women melted snow in kettles and cursed the smoke. Horses were led to the shore and made to nose at chopped holes in brackish ice. Afternoon, Amos was sent toward the marsh, because someone remembered that Ingrid had sunk a shallow pump near the lee side of her cottage. No one expected it to work. Shallow pumps always froze first. Amos found Maren outside with a bucket. The girl worked the handle twice. Water came out. Clear water, liquid water. In a village where iron hinges snapped from cold and laundry froze stiff before it could be pinned. Ingrid Madsen's little pump was still alive. Amos stared at it. Then he saw why. The pump stood inside the angle formed by the deep entry and the thick south wall. It was sheltered from wind. The ground there was not bare, not spring-like, not miraculous. Snow around the base had thinned into a dark, wet crescent. A tiny leakage of warmth from the house, too small to waste, had been enough to keep the pump throat from freezing solid. Not a miracle. A margin. And in a hard winter, margins are everything. By evening, neighbors came with pails. Some apologized. Most did not. Ingrid did not ask them to. She filled their buckets and told Maren to keep the door closed between trips. Amos stayed after the others left. He looked at the gray walls, the quiet chimney, the unbroken snow on the roof, and the working pump beside the frozen marsh. All the evidence had been in front of him, but he had been measuring the wrong thing. He had judged the material by its danger when loose. Ingrid had designed around its behavior when contained. He had seen grass. She had seen trapped air. He had seen fuel. She had seen resistance. Finally, he said, I called this house a coffin. Ingrid waited. Amos looked toward the pump, where the last bucket steamed faintly in the brutal air. I was wrong. For a long moment, Ingrid said nothing. Then she handed him the bucket. Then carry water, she said. By the time the thaw came, no one called it the kelp coffin anymore. The Maine did not vanish all at once. Names like that rarely do, but it lost its teeth. A fisherman asked Ingrid how she kept the roof from leaking. A carpenter asked whether eelgrass should be packed tight or springy. Amos Pike inspected her chimney again and wrote, in his official notebook, "Safe, wall clear, unusual construction, no immediate hazard observed." For Amos, that was practically a hymn. In the spring, Ingrid helped 3 families retrofit their coldest rooms. Not with blind copying. She was careful about that. The seaweed had to be dry. The weatherskin had to shed rain. The stove had to be isolated. The wall had to stop wind without trapping rot. A material was never a miracle by itself. A system was what mattered. Years later, when people told the story, they made it simpler. They said a Danish widow built a house out of seaweed and embarrassed the whole village. That version is satisfying. It is also too small. Satisfying. It is also too small. The real lesson is sharper. The villages were not stupid. Amos was not cruel. The carpenters were not useless. They knew fire. They knew storms. They knew the way bad houses kill people. But their knowledge had a boundary. They understood materials as they had always used them. Ingrid understood the same material under different conditions. Loose eelgrass on a hearth is a hazard. Wet eelgrass in a wall is rot. Dry eelgrass packed correctly behind a weatherskin is something else entirely. This is how many old innovations look before they are understood. Ugly, foreign, embarrassing, unsafe, impossible. Then the weather arrives. Or the machine fails. Or the official answer runs out. And suddenly the thing everyone laughed at becomes the only thing still working. So the next time you feel a cold draft across the floor, remember Ingrid Madsen's seaweed house. The problem may not be the size of the fire. It may be the leak in the bucket. Heat is always trying to leave. Winter only wins when we make it easy. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments. What is the coldest room you have ever lived in? And what finally fixed it? And subscribe for more stories of forgotten engineering, strange materials, and the people who understood them before the rest of the world caught up. Disclaimer: this video is a historically inspired reconstruction for education and storytelling. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, while the building principles discussed are based on real thermal concepts and traditional natural material practices. Do not attempt any building technique without modern code compliance, fire safety review, moisture control, and professional guidance.